Volume 4 C25. Ainz followed behind the dwarves into their council chamber using the same measured and artful steps he observed Queen Draudillan using when she walked from place to place. Stately and more sure on the outside than on the inside, his rich robes hid the faint tremble of his own anxiety, his mask held back the bated breath from observation. Only the flowing white enchanted garment hid the fact that he broke out into a cold sweat when he thought of the presentation he was about to give. The dwarves were a burly lot, rather hasty in their movement. Their stumpy legs carried them over the smooth floor of the inner chamber with the same speed that little bugs could use to scramble away from a hand about to swat them or a foot about to unthinkingly crush them. They got into their seats arrayed in a long line at a table where they seemed to work in common. This too was stone seemingly carved out of the mountain itself rather than made elsewhere and carried within. On either side of Ainz sat a number of chairs, but no other desks, presumably for hearing the complaints and entreaties of their population. Ainz took the initiative, speaking first as he approached. He loomed over them like a giant, and the glowstones on the wall radiated off of the white and gold garment which only added to his almost divine and majestic aura. As I said, the kingdom of Nazarick has come to negotiate. You know my desire, trade. I will bring you what you can't produce, and you will provide me with runecraft weapons and armor. If your runesmiths will come to my kingdom, then my prosperity and protection will come to yours. That caused the councillors to shift with discomfort in their seats. They traded wary looks, but looked up at the masked face. Mighty Lord, you could just buy the runecraft weapons from us. Why would you want our actual runesmiths to join you in your homeland? The forge master's fingers twitched a little, scraping over the table, and Ainz's estimation of that one went up a notch. Because I want a monopoly on runecraft, I want to use it as the foundation for equipping my adventurers at the cost of the state. It may even be used for broader military applications. Therefore it must be produced inside my kingdom. That led to a moment of silence. Forgive me, but I have to say, you're in a very grim position right now. Is it really the time to haggle? I have no intention of kidnapping, harming, or otherwise enslaving or abusing your kindred. I will add as a provision that you may send inspectors and observers to where the dwarves will live and work. That is fair, isn't it? Ainz asked, holding out his upturned hand and giving a half bow with his other hand on his chest. But runecraft hasn't had value in a very long time. The oldest of dwarves groused, forgive me, but this all seems strange. You know its advantages, the complete lack of cost other than time, and the ability to lay multiple enchantments on a single object. How can I, a head of state, not see the value in something like that? Plus, you saw the blade from before. Your ancient arts have far more potential than you remember. Ainz promised. The shifting in their seats, the sound of rubbing leather and fabric was the only one they made for a few seconds as their discomfort collectively grew. Ainz hammered home the point. Your numbers dwindle, you are threatened by the Quagga, and even in good times, the mountain couldn't feed very many of you. I offer you safety, I offer you trade in food and resources, and what I want from you in return, ancient friends. His extended hand closed into a fist and his index finger uncurled so that it pointed at them, is for you to bloom again. It was an electric phrase which froze them in their seats as he assailed their pride with the promise of untapped potential, security, their greed with the possibility of prosperity again, and attacked their fear of extermination with the promise of military security against their enemy. But the dwarves were a stubborn race, and though they felt the call to offer themselves down to the very core of their spirits, the way Ainz spoke laid bare one more question. Majesty. The head of the effectively defunct Commerce Department spoke. How old are you exactly? Ainz sighed to cover his panic in that question. His heart raced as he struggled to find something that would cause no controversy and which couldn't be fact-checked later to falsify his claim of old origins. His hand fell away, and he hung his head. All that I have known, the greatest of heroes and friends, are gone. The stars in the sky I saw the night of my awakening, they too were unknown to me. Everything around me is unfamiliar now, and you could say that I am from a lost world. I don't even know the full answer to your question, though it weighs heavy on my heart. Was that too melodramatic? It's all sort of true. Kind of. If you squint and look at it just the right way. I mean, I don't exactly have a calendar, so I don't even know if my birthday will have come and gone by now. Ainz put his hand over his mask when he instinctively face-palmed. If Pandora's actor ever saw me pull that. Good God, no. Don't tell me he gets all his behavior from me. Then Ainz caught himself. Face-palming may or may not have been a thing done there, but now he had to cover for it. Sloppy, Ainz. Very sloppy. He thought and said, if I want you to trust me, I should show you my face. This body. It isn't the one I began with, it is one of many I've inhabited, and it will be with me for some time, he said, and the dwarf council members leaned forward, their own bodies shaking with anticipation. All that is true too. If you count other game avatars I've used, plus the one I was born with, and the skeletal body I had and then lost, and now this one. Sure, the most believable lies are true. Ainz reassured himself and removed his mask. The dwarves sucked in their teeth in relief. A low chuckle came up from them. Majesty, forgive us, but the way you spoke we were half afraid you were undead. Who knows how that might have gone? Their eldest said and turned to their military commander. We can hammer out the details later, but for now if we want your help. And, can you really help? The dwarves all stiffened. Easily. If the Quagga have not been strong enough to defeat you by now, they're no threat to me. Ainz replied offhandedly while replacing his mask and hiding the flesh and blood face again. Then tell him. The old dwarf said with finality, and slumped back in his chair. The commanding general answered immediately, we're less than 2 years from extinction. The population doesn't know it, but we don't have long. Our outlying settlements were left to their local defenders. We can't hold any more people, we can barely feed the ones we have. If the bridge over the Great Rift falls then our city will have only one door between us and dying out. In the event of a siege we can survive for a year or two if everything goes perfectly well. If it doesn't, we might not last more than a few months. I see. Ainz replied and put his hands on his hips, then let me make this offer. Become my vassals, swear loyalty to Nazarick, give me the runesmiths, and I will let no more of you die by Quagga and claws. Become my forge, and I will be your shield and sword. Ainz promised, as it was, it will be again, and no dwarf will live in fear anymore. Oh God, he does get it from me. Ainz realized with horror as he pictured Pandora's actor saying exactly the same thing, in exactly the same way. Volume 4 C26. What you ask? That is a great deal. We know little about your country. The hard-nosed dwarven elder said with a weighty voice, but he could not meet the masked face or clasp the hand which offered salvation. Will the Quagga offer you a better deal? And even if you win, can you defeat the dragons? And they are not the only evils who would destroy you. Ancient evils come and go in this world. I offer to share our strength. Are you strong enough to refuse the offer and still stand alone? Ainz asked of them, and they one and all answered by looking down at the table as if it were quite fascinating. Can you give us some time to think about this? The Forge Master asked with the utmost humility. Ainz let his hand fall away. That is fair, but remember this. It would be unnatural for me to offer my help for nothing after you refuse me. If I leave the Dwarf Kingdom with nothing, then nothing of my kingdom will come to the Dwarf Kingdom in return. Ainz suppressed his inner cringe at his melodramatically deep voice. The tastes of this world are bizarre. He screamed in his head and wondered again if perhaps he was not the one who was strange. Let us offer you our hospitality for the night at least. We have wonderful beer, and Ainz held up a hand. Let me offer a gift, a small token if you will, to show my goodwill. Ainz interrupted and reached into his dimensional space. In the long ago vanished world, they also had beer, some of them were old even when I was young. Let me offer you a taste of the past in the hopes of a brighter future, Ainz said, and withdrew 3 small boxes. This one, he held up a can, is called Guinness. It comes from a people who are famous for their dark brews. He held up another, this time a bottle. This one comes from another country, called Arrogant Bastard Ale. Note the cocky look of the demon on the glass. He then held up another, this time a small white bottle, and this one is called Sake. A personal favorite of mine. He laid the boxes down. By stroke of luck each box held enough for the Dwarf Council to have 1 bottle each. Their noses began to twitch. Yes, we thank your majesty for his generosity. Of course we will make our first toast to yourself. But first we should provide you with quarters. The aged council member said and stood up. He yanked a short rope, and from just beyond the door, a bell rang incessantly until someone came rushing inside. Gaundo? We were calling for an escort. The Forge Master snapped. Gaundo pointed down to his feet. I got feet, I can take whomever, wherever. The Forge Master rolled his eyes. Fine, whatever. You know this part of the city, take His Majesty to the finest empty house we have, give him whatever he wants, down to your last beer until it's time for him to talk to us again. To their surprise, Gaundo nodded with such wild enthusiasm that his beard bounced off his barrel chest. Of course, there's no problem with that. Furrowed brows and deep-set eyes were turned on Gaundo. Down to the last beer was a very serious order, and not one of the dwarves followed eagerly, as it might well come down to that. But Gaundo didn't seem to care. Your Majesty, Gaundo said with a deep bow at the waist. This is strange. I was trying to win the council over. Why does this one sound so enthusiastic? Ainz wondered, but quietly accepted the evident devotion as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Lead on, I am in your care, Gaundo, Ainz said, and when Gaundo straightened up, Ainz followed after him. When they were outside again, such as it was while inside a mountain, the fire-red bearded dwarf asked, My lord, did you really mean what you said about runecraft? Every word, Ainz replied without hesitation. Then, I know I'm supposed to take you to where you'll sleep for the night, but if I could ask you, would you like to meet with the other runesmiths? Some of them heard what you said, the same way I did. Word spread from them to the others, and I've gathered them together at a tavern. What for? Ainz asked. He furrowed his brow behind the mask. My lord, we want to come with you. We've got no future here, our craft. Our own people don't much care for it anymore. I saw your sword, they're not quite convinced yet, a little on the fence, but most of us want to go where we can practice our skills again. Gaundo replied. He took a step ahead of the king and turned around to look up at him. Stopping in his tracks, he said, I'm a rune developer, been at it for years trying to find a way to save the art from dying. But it didn't mean anything, and now there aren't so many of us anymore in the first place. I was out there in the crowd when you showed that sword. Please, just a few minutes of your time. Gaundo was all but begging. You've got no idea what it's like, to see something you devoted your whole life to just dying off, fading away and threatening to disappear. It looks like you might be our second chance. I'd give my soul for that, the whole damn thing, Gaundo insisted with fervency and shaking hands that were clasped like he was praying. To see someone so devoted to their craft that they would abandon literally everything, it reminded Ainz of how he felt about Yggdrasil and his guild. His affection meter for Gaundo went higher than it had since he began his journey and crystallized into resolve. All right, I will meet with them, he said, and set aside any misgivings he might have harbored before. Gaundo veered off their prior course and led him to walk down a narrow street. While they drew many a look from dwarves before, they were now out of sight of any of them, but it didn't take long to get where Gaundo intended him to be. Gaundo flung open the door and shouted before Ainz could follow, On your feet. Rise for the king. And the sound of dozens of dwarves hopping off their chairs hit like the sound of a military formation. This is off to a good start, Ainz reflected as he ducked under the doorway to enter the room with a fresh audience. Volume 4 C27. Ainz made the most stately walk he could manage to the far end of the room. His rich mage robes swayed around his calves until they came to a slow stop when he turned around and faced the runesmiths. Be seated, Ainz said to the assembled dwarves, and when they sat, he asked one straightforward question. Does your art have a future here? The rumble of dwarves was like a distant thunder, their discontent obvious, their faces reddened within the open space around their many-colored beards. Some of them actually shook with rage, while others had their eyes glassed over with tears of frustration or despair. Only the fire-bearded Gaundo chose to speak. No. I've tried to make them see, tried harder than anybody knows or could even imagine. His tense body slumped in his chair, his arms fell out of his lap where they sat and hung dead at his sides like weary fish that had given up fighting the fisherman's deadly line. But nothing works. Gaundo shook his head. Do you want to restore your craft again? Ainz asked of them, do you want to make? And then reaching into his pocket dimension, he drew again the sword which held them spellbound in the square. This? Ooze and ache came from the dozens of mouths beneath the dozens of eyes that looked with an almost lustful hunger. Ainz looked out over the little sea of bearded faces, and reflexively handed the Yggdrasil sword to Gaundo. If we follow you, we get to try to rediscover the lost arts that made this thing of beauty? Gaundo asked, and every eye shifted from the blade to Ainz himself. It was only with the greatest reluctance, and the greatest reverence, that Gondo passed the sword from one hand to another so that each smith of the dying art got to hold it. Yes. I will provide you with the resources, metals, food, shelter, clothing, equipment, workspace, all that you need. I've already spoken with your leaders. They are willing to accept your departure, on condition of your good treatment, but they didn't care about losing your craft, Ainz said, and with that he drove the final nail into the coffin of the dwarven runesmiths to remain in their country. Will you come with me? Ainz asked when the sword made its way back to him. He took the blade and opened his dimensional storage to store it. Gondo's eyes widened, nor were his alone in doing so. The sword. If I don't go with him, I'll never see it again. The thought came not only to him, but to all the runesmiths, and before the pocket dimension closed and the hand of the king withdrew, the dwarves were on their feet again. I will, they shouted with such violent, frantic enthusiasm it was as if they feared there was a time limit on his question. The next hour to 3 was a whirlwind of activity as the runesmiths insisted on lining up, and one by one, kneeling before the king and swearing their loyalty. The first among them was Gondo Firebeard. I pledge my craft, mind, and soul to your service, he said with his head bowed low. It was short, simple, pragmatic, and every bit what Ainz was beginning to expect out of the dwarves. He said it with such fervence that when he rose and stood aside, each dwarf after him repeated the same phrase. When it was finally over, Ainz gave them simple instructions. Get your rest, get the things you need, and get ready to work hard for me. Yes, sire. The runesmiths cried out, and finally began to filter out of his presence. Gondo alone remained to escort Ainz to his temporary quarters. It was a luxuriously large building, at least as far as the simple, Spartan dwarven architecture went. But it was furnished with fine materials, a good, broad bed with a thick mattress, blankets, a single wide black pillow, the same as the blanket. I will be in the room just outside your own, Your Highness, Gondo said and pointed to the door nearby. I should be fine, but I will call you if I need anything, Ainz said as he stood in the center of the room. Thank you, Your Majesty. Gondo replied with a broad and greatly relieved smile spread over his face. Ainz inclined his head in a polite nod, and the door closed behind the dwarf a moment later as Gondo left him alone. As soon as that was the case, Ainz cast several spells in rapid succession. Silence of the grave, hide presence, conceal greater magic. Each spell briefly lit the air around him, and it was done. When it was, Ainz cast, message. Demiurge, I am ready for you. The gate opened, and Demiurge stepped out from the whirling void and knelt before his master. My lord, he said with his head bowed, how goes your master plan? What master plan? Ainz asked himself with annoyance. Very well. The runesmiths are mine, and the dwarves are discussing coming over to my side. The crystalline eyes sparkled on the face of the demon. As expected of the last supreme being. My own feeble efforts are a mere shadow of your wisdom. In accordance with my pathetic understanding of your grand design, I have. And then for the next 2 hours Demiurge explained the story of Yaldabaoth, the demon emperor, the ancient awakened evil, his killing of the leader of the frost dragons, and the chaos he sowed among the dwarves and the Quagga. In fact, some of both are on the way here. Demiurge went on to explain his missing army and the clues he left in the ears of the Quaggoan, dragon, and dwarven witnesses. I had planned to use some of the pop monsters of Nazarick for that purpose, uniting all races under the mountain against the demon emperor, and thus, in accordance with your masterful plan, put them under you. I will have to thin their numbers of course. Ainz held up his hand and went to sit on the bed. Demiurge stopped. He had a smile on his face that reminded Ainz of a child presenting a project to his parents after working hard on it. Eager for approval, eager for their pride. But to that, Ainz could say very little. I can't let him run wild, but I don't want to hurt him either. And if I can keep the Quagga and the dwarves in fear and awe of him, that will bind them tighter to me and prevent future deaths. Ainz thought about that and let his hands fall limp on his lap. He considered the former question, what he'd asked before entering the mountain, and changed it. Demiurge. What was Albert to you?